Renata Osei was 40 years old when she buried her husband, or believed she did, on a cold Tuesday in November, with 37 people standing in a cemetery in Nashville and a casket that she would later learn had never held the man she had married. She was not a woman people looked at twice. She drove a 10-year-old Accord. She wore her hair natural and her clothes practical, and she brought food to every church gathering without being asked. Her husband, Clifton Osei, had spent 12 years introducing her to his colleagues as his rock, which she had always understood was a word men used for women they depended on without fully valuing. His colleagues called her Quiet Renata, and she did not correct them, because she was quiet, and because she had learned from her father that the people who underestimated you were telling you something useful about themselves. The death certificate said cardiac arrest. The insurance policy Clifton had taken out 18 months before his alleged death was worth $480,000, and within 2 weeks of the funeral, the claim had been filed on her behalf by an attorney she had not retained. The policy named her as beneficiary. The money arrived in a joint account she shared access to. She did not touch it. What Clifton did not know, what the woman he had built this plan with did not know, was that Renata had spent 17 years as a forensic accountant and had built an entire career around the principle that the numbers always told you what the story was trying to hide. She saw her husband alive at the Nashville International Airport on a Wednesday afternoon in February, 3 months after they put his casket in the ground. He did not see her. That was his last mistake. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the windows of the house on Sycamore Drive at an angle that Renata had always loved, a low winter slant that caught the grain of the hardwood floors she had refinished herself the spring before last. She had done it over a long weekend, renting the sander, going with the grain, applying the finish in thin, even coats the way her father had taught her to do anything that was worth doing correctly. The floors had come out better than she had expected, warm and even, and smelling faintly still of the oil finish when the heat came on. She stood in that light every morning with her coffee and let it settle into her before the day started. Her father, Samuel Boateng, had been a civil inspector for the city of Nashville for 31 years, the man who signed off on whether a thing was built the way the plans said it should be built, and he had brought that same standard to everything he touched. He had died 5 years ago, and she still heard him most mornings. He used to say, "Renata, a lie has exactly one advantage over the truth. It arrives faster. But it doesn't hold." She had worked in forensic accounting for 17 years. She had sat across tables from men who had built elaborate financial lies and watched those lies come apart with the particular speed of things that had never been properly load-bearing to begin with. She was good at her work, in the way that people were good at things they had chosen from a genuine interior need rather than circumstance. And her firm in Nashville trusted her with the cases that required not just skill but patience, and the willingness to sit with incomplete information until it completed itself. Only her senior partner and her personal attorney knew the full scope of what she held in her own name and what she had been quietly building for a decade. Clifton had never asked about her professional accounts, and she had never raised them. She had met Clifton 11 years ago at a professional development conference in Memphis, one of those Friday evening receptions that existed mostly so people could exchange business cards and pretend they were not tired. He had been in commercial insurance sales, broad-shouldered and easy with people, the kind of man who made a room feel smaller and warmer just by being present in it. And he had found her at the window table with her sparkling water and asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, what she found interesting about the room. She had told him what she actually found interesting, which was the acoustics, which were poor, and he had laughed in a way that reached his eyes and said, "You are the most precise person I have met all week." She had thought that was the most refreshing thing a man had said to her in months. She had been wrong about what kind of precision he valued in her. The trouble in the marriage had gathered so quietly that she had almost missed the beginning of it. Clifton had always traveled for work. Insurance sales required travel, and she had never questioned the rhythms of it. But beginning about 20 months before his death, something in the texture of his travel had changed, a quality she could not name at first, but that she registered the way she registered anomalies in financial records, as a deviation from the established pattern that did not yet have an explanation, but required one. The calls home were shorter. The hotel names were occasionally unfamiliar. He had taken out 2 new insurance policies in an 18-month span, one of which named her as sole beneficiary, and the other of which she had not known existed until after the funeral. There was also a woman named Sandra, whose name she had seen in his phone once on a Sunday morning when it buzzed face up on the kitchen counter, and she read the preview before she had decided not to. She had noted it. She had not confronted it. She was a forensic accountant. She did not move on a single data point. The death had come in the form of a phone call on a Thursday evening in November from a number she did not recognize. A man's voice, unfamiliar, telling her that her husband had been found unresponsive in a hotel room in Memphis and that emergency services had been unable to revive him. The voice gave her the name of a hospital. The voice gave her a case number. She wrote both down with the same steady hand she brought to everything, and then she sat for a very long time in the kitchen with those numbers in front of her and felt the floor of the world shift beneath her feet in a way she had no framework for yet. She had grieved. She wanted to be honest about that, because it was true. Whatever had been building in the margins of that marriage, she had loved him once, and the grief was real even before she understood that its object was not. The funeral was on a Tuesday. 37 people. A closed casket. She had asked why the casket was closed. The funeral director had cited the condition of the body following the cardiac event. She had accepted this. She was not, in those weeks, operating at full capacity. She was grieving, and grief is its own kind of weather that makes the normal instruments unreliable. She filed no insurance claim herself. The claim was filed 2 weeks after the funeral by an attorney in Memphis she had never heard of, acting, he stated in a letter to the insurance company, on behalf of the estate. She did not know this had happened until the insurance company sent a confirmation letter to the house. She read the letter 3 times. Her hands did not shake. She set the letter on the desk and opened her laptop and began, with the unhurried focus of someone who understood that the work in front of her was simply a larger version of work she had done before, to pull the threads. She was a forensic accountant. She had spent 17 years finding what the numbers were hiding. The numbers always hid the same things. They hid movement. They hid timing. They hid the moments when money changed direction, and changed direction again, and arrived somewhere it had not started. She pulled everything she had access to. Bank statements going back 24 months. Credit card records she had not looked at closely. The insurance policy documents, which she requested directly from the carrier. The estate attorney's letter, cross-referenced against the bar directory for the state of Tennessee, which confirmed that the man who had filed the claim was a licensed attorney, but one whose practice consisted almost entirely of insurance transactions in a narrow geographic corridor between Nashville and Memphis. She built a timeline. It took 4 days. What the timeline showed, assembled on a spreadsheet she did not give a name to because she did not need to perform this for anyone but herself, was that Clifton had begun redirecting small amounts of money from their joint savings account beginning 22 months before his death, amounts small enough to sit below the threshold of her casual attention, consistent enough to reveal intention when mapped across the full period. The total redirected was $67,000 over 22 months. The destination was an account she could not identify from the information available to her, which told her it was not his, and not joint, but a third account held in a name she did not yet have. The insurance policy had been taken out 19 months before the death, which meant it had been taken out 1 month after the redirections began. The plan had been 2 years in the building. Her face remained perfectly calm. She was at the airport on the Wednesday in February because she was flying to Cincinnati for a client engagement. An audit of a manufacturing company's expense reporting that her firm had been engaged to conduct. She was at gate C-17 with her carry-on and her coffee when she saw him. He was 40 feet away and moving in the opposite direction, toward the B concourse, wearing a gray coat she did not recognize and pulling a rolling bag she had never seen. And the woman beside him was Sandra, whose name she had read in a phone preview 16 months ago and filed without acting on. They were not rushing. They walked the way people walked when they were somewhere familiar, with the ease of a shared routine. She watched him for 11 seconds before he passed out of her direct sightline. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She did not follow him. She did not call out. She took her phone from her pocket and opened the camera and documented everything she could see: the gate signage, the direction of travel, the timestamp visible on the airport's departure board. She photographed Sandra's face from a distance that was sufficient for identification purposes. She sat back down in her seat and sent 3 photographs and a written summary of what she had witnessed to her personal email account, then forwarded everything immediately to her senior partner with a message that said, "I need our attorney on a call within the hour." She boarded her flight to Cincinnati. She did her work in Cincinnati. She was thorough and complete. She flew home on Friday. She had placed a name beside the things she had seen, and the name was insurance fraud, and she had spent enough of her career working adjacent to that particular crime to know exactly which institutions needed to know what she knew, and in what order. Preparation was the work. She had always known that. Brenda Atchison had practiced civil and criminal law in Nashville for 26 years and had a reputation in the legal community as someone who did not take cases she did not intend to win. She was 63, silver-haired, and had the quality of total stillness that Renata associated with people who had been in enough difficult rooms to know that stillness was the most effective posture available. She had been Renata's personal attorney for 8 years. They met on Monday morning. Renata brought 2 folders. The first contained the timeline she had built, the bank redirection data, the insurance policy documents, the estate attorney's correspondence, and the financial summary her senior partner had helped her expand over the weekend to include 3 additional account traces she had identified through professional channels. The second folder contained the airport photographs and her written documentation of the sighting. Brenda reviewed both folders completely before she spoke. She said, "The insurance fraud exposure alone carries federal implications. The staged death, the fraudulent claim, the forged death certificate." She said it the way she said everything, as a list of facts arranged in order of their legal weight. She said, "You have not touched the insurance payout?" Renata said she had not. Brenda said, "Good," she said. "I am going to contact the FBI field office this afternoon. What you have documented is a federal matter, and the documentation is clean." She set the folders square on her desk and looked at Renata. She said, "I want you to understand that once I make this call, it moves without you. You will not be managing it. You do not need to manage it. You did the work. The work is done." Renata said she understood. She did understand. She had spent 17 years knowing the difference between the part of the work that required her and the part that did not. The investigation required her knowledge. The arrest did not. Real power operated in quiet rooms, and she had done her work in the quietest room she had. By Thursday, Brenda had connected Renata with a private investigator named Wallace, who had spent 20 years in federal law enforcement before retiring to private practice, and who had the particular economy of motion that men who had done that work carried into everything afterward. He reviewed the documentation Renata had assembled and said 3 words: "This is organized." He meant it as a professional observation, but she heard it as the most accurate description of 12 years of marriage she had encountered yet. Wallace spent 4 days adding to what she had already built. He identified the second identity Clifton had been assembling, a name that appeared on a driver's license issued in Louisiana 14 months before the staged death, and on a lease agreement for a property in Baton Rouge, signed 11 months prior. The lease was in 2 names. The second name was Sandra Merritt, whose professional background Wallace traced to a claims adjusting firm in Memphis, where Clifton had been a client account for 6 years, which answered the question of how they had met and when. The timeline the 2 of them had built together, mapped against what Renata had already assembled, was 23 months from first contact to staged death. 2 years of planning. In the same house, in the same bed, at the same table where she had made his coffee and asked about his day and trusted the answer she was given. She did not allow herself to stay in that room for long. She was a forensic accountant. She understood that the emotional response to evidence was a real thing, but that it was not the same thing as the evidence, and that dwelling in it beyond what was necessary served no purpose except to slow the work. She let herself feel it for one evening, sitting in the kitchen with the floor she had refinished and the particular angle of the winter light, and then she set it down and went back to the spreadsheet. Wallace's additional findings went into Brenda's file on a Friday morning. Brenda reviewed them and said, "This is a comprehensive record. When the federal agents request your cooperation, and they will request it, this is what you provide." Renata said she understood. Some things you built all the way before you handed them over. That was what the work required. She drove from Brenda's office to her Uncle Gerald's house in East Nashville, where Gerald Boateng, her father's younger brother, still lived in the house where the 2 brothers had grown up. A craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch and a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee, and the particular warm wood smell of a house that had been maintained rather than renovated. Gerald was 68, retired from the Postal Service, and had the patient, exact quality of a man who had spent decades delivering things to the right address and understood that accuracy was a form of respect. She sat at his kitchen table and told him what she had seen and what she had found and what Brenda had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. Then he said, "I want to tell you something I noticed at the funeral." He said the casket had been closed, and he had thought that was unusual given that the death had supposedly been a cardiac event in a hotel room, which would not typically require a closed viewing. He said he had mentioned this to her aunt at the time and had been told to let it go, out of respect for the family's grief. He had let it go. He looked at her now and said, "Your father would have said the same thing I'm about to say." He said, "The truth has a weight to it. It sits in a room differently than a lie does." I felt the wrong weight at that funeral. "I should have said something," she said. "You're saying it now." He said, "I'm saying it now." He said, "Your father used to tell me, the lie arrives fast, but it doesn't hold." He was right about that in 1987, and he's right about it today. She drove home. She was not angry. She had moved through anger quickly in those first days after the airport, because anger required ongoing investment in someone who no longer deserved the expenditure. What she felt instead was the particular clarity of a person who had located the precise source of a problem and had already begun the work of correcting it. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. She had better uses for her attention. The FBI field office moved with an efficiency that surprised even Brenda. The death certificate was determined to be fraudulent within 2 weeks, the signature of the certifying physician having been forged on a document filed in Shelby County. The identity documentation Clifton had used to board his flight, the flight Renata had photographed the departure board for, traced to a second identity that had been constructed over a period of 18 months preceding the staged death. The account that had received the $67,000 in redirected funds from the joint savings was registered in that second name. Sandra, whose surname was Merritt, was identified as a co-conspirator and arrested at a property in Baton Rouge, where she and Clifton had been living under the constructed identities for 3 months. Clifton was arrested at the same property. He was brought back to Nashville to face charges that included insurance fraud, identity fraud, filing a false death certificate, and conspiracy, among others. The insurance payout, which Renata had not touched, was returned to the carrier in full. The $67,000 in redirected marital assets was identified as recoverable in the civil, proceeding that Brenda filed concurrent with the criminal matter. Renata attended none of the hearings. She had provided her documentation and her testimony, and she had done so with the thorough, organized precision of a woman who understood that the quality of the record was the quality of the outcome. And then she had returned to her work, which was what she had always done when she had finished the part of a thing that required her. 14 months after the arrest, Renata sat on the back porch of the Sycamore Drive house on an April evening as the light came through the oak tree she had planted in the first year she owned the house. The tree now tall enough to give real shade, its early spring leaves catching the last of the afternoon in a way that made the yard look like something from a painting. She had potted herbs along the porch railing, rosemary, thyme. A basil she was less confident about, and the evening smelled of those things and of the neighbor's late-blooming wisteria 2 houses down. She had been promoted to senior partner at her firm in January, the first person in the firm's 20-year history to reach that level before 42. The work she had done on the Osai case, as it had come to be known in her firm's internal documentation, had led to a referral from the FBI field office to 2 additional forensic engagements that had expanded both her reputation and the firm's practice in ways that were still compounding. Her accountant had revised her compensation projection upward twice in the past year. She had taken on a junior associate in the spring, a careful young woman named Priya who reminded her of herself at that age. Precise, observational, not yet certain how much those qualities were worth. And she had begun the particular work of showing someone else how to use what they had. There was a man named Darius who appeared in her evenings with the unhurried presence of someone who was not performing for her and had never tried to. He was a civil engineer she had met through Gerald's neighbor at a backyard gathering the previous summer. A quiet, careful man who asked questions that told her he understood what she did and why it mattered, who had sat on this same porch on a Saturday afternoon and asked about the oak tree and listened with genuine interest to how long it had taken to grow to its current size and what kind of maintenance it required. He was not the center of her life. He was present in it, and his presence had the quality of something chosen rather than settled for. She had heard from Brenda that Clifton had accepted a plea arrangement. The sentencing had resulted in a term that Brenda had described as appropriate given the scope and the premeditation. Sandra Merritt had accepted a separate arrangement. The insurance company had filed its own civil action and recovered from both parties. Clifton's brother, who had known nothing of the plan, had cut off contact the day the arrest was reported. His former colleagues in insurance sales, a community with a long institutional memory for this category of offense, had ensured that his professional life in that field was closed to him permanently. Renata did not follow the details closely. She had noted them and released them in the way she released completed cases, with the clean satisfaction of work properly done and the understanding that the ongoing narrative of the villain's consequences was not hers to narrate. The coffee in her hand was the good kind, the kind she bought for herself now without the small interior hesitation that had once accompanied expenditures purely on her own behalf. The oak tree moved in the evening air. The basil was, she decided, going to be fine. She had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.